All right, picture this. It's 1951. India is a brand new country, a new republic, and it's already staring down its first massive constitutional crisis. Now, this isn't a war, it's not a famine, it's a battle in a courtroom. But this one case, wow, it would kick off a fight that would last for decades. A fight for the very soul of India's new constitution. A showdown between its highest ideals and its toughest realities.
And really, that's the big question we're diving into here. What happens when a country's beautiful, noble ideals crash right into a messy, complicated reality? You see, newly independent India had this incredible new constitution, just full of promises about justice and fairness for all. But the reality on the ground? It was a country still dealing with deep, deep inequality. And this case is all about what happens when those two things collide.
So let's break this conflict down to its very core. Because that's what it was, a fundamental conflict. On one side, you've got a promise, a beautiful one, written right into the Constitution, and on the other, a huge, ugly problem inherited from the past.
So here's the promise. The Constitution guaranteed a fundamental right to property. Simple enough, right? Your land is your land, period. But here's the problem. This thing called the zamindari system. This was an old feudal system where a tiny number of super powerful landlords owned vast amounts of land, while millions of farmers were essentially trapped in poverty, working on that very land. For the new government, this system had to go. It wasn't just unfair, it was holding the entire country back. But, and this is the million-dollar question, how could they possibly break up this system and redistribute land without breaking that fundamental promise they had just made in their new constitution?
And this is where things started to get really messy. State governments in places like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh went ahead and passed laws to get rid of the zamindari system. And what happened? Well, exactly what you'd expect. The landlords fought back. They took these laws to court, and the result was a complete constitutional nightmare. Get this, the High Court in Patna said the Bihar law was unconstitutional and struck it down. But at the exact same time, the High Court in Allahabad looked at a very similar law in UP and said it was perfectly fine. The government was facing total legal chaos.
So with the courts in total disagreement and their biggest social reform plan grinding to a halt, what could the government possibly do? Well, they didn't just find a solution, they basically invented one out of thin air. It was a move that was as brilliant as it was controversial, and it would change Indian law forever.
Instead of getting stuck in years of court battles, Prime Minister Nehru's government decided to just change the rules of the game. They didn't just pass another law, they went straight to the source and amended the Constitution itself. This was the First Amendment Act of 1951, and believe me, this wasn't some minor correction. This was a massive constitutional power move.
So how did they do it? With this incredibly clever, three-part legal shield. First, they added Article 31A to give special protection to land reform laws. Then, Article 31B, which created a kind of safe harbor. But the real masterstroke, the absolute game changer, was the ninth schedule. The best way to think about this is like a magic box. The government could pass a law, drop it into this box, and poof, it was totally immune from being challenged in court for violating fundamental rights. It was legally bulletproof.
Now, you can't just create a constitutional magic box that bypasses fundamental rights and expect everyone to just go along with it. Of course not. This radical new amendment was challenged almost immediately, and the whole fight headed straight to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court.
And this is where our title character Shankari Prasad comes in. He was a zamindar, a landlord, and he and others filed a case. But their argument was incredibly bold. They weren't just challenging the land reform laws anymore. No, they were challenging the First Amendment itself. Their point was simple. Parliament had gone too far. They just didn't have the power to change the Constitution in a way that took away people's fundamental rights.
So this dropped a massive question right on the Supreme Court's doorstep. Everyone knew Article 368 gave Parliament the power to amend the Constitution. But was that power unlimited? Was it a blank check? Could Parliament use it to change or even completely remove the sacred fundamental rights that were supposed to be the bedrock of the new republic?
Okay, this is where it gets a little technical, but stick with me, because this is the absolute heart of the case. There's another article, Article 13, which basically says the government can't pass any law that takes away fundamental rights. So the landlord's lawyers made this brilliant argument. They said, hey, this First Amendment, it's a law, right? And it's definitely taking away our right to property, so it should be void. The entire case, everything came down to this one question. Is a constitutional amendment the same thing as a regular, ordinary law? So, with the whole nation watching, the Supreme Court's 5-judge bench came back with its answer. And that decision was clear, it was unanimous, and boy, was it a big deal. The court's entire logic hinged on this crucial distinction. They said, look, Parliament basically wears two different hats. When it's wearing its normal legislative hat, it passes ordinary laws, traffic laws, tax codes, stuff like that. And those laws absolutely cannot violate fundamental rights. But, the court said, Parliament has another, much more powerful hat. It's constituent power. This isn't the power to make rules within the game. This is the power to change the rules of the game itself. It's the power to literally remake the Constitution. And because an amendment was an act of the superior constituent power, the court said it was not an ordinary law under Article 13, which meant that restriction didn't apply. The bottom line from the court was this: Parliament's power to amend the Constitution under Article 368 was absolute. It included the power to amend any part of it, and yes, that included the fundamental rights.
So the outcome was decisive. The First Amendment, the Ninth Schedule, the whole shebang, it was all declared perfectly valid. The government's land reforms could move forward. Shankari Prasad's case was thrown out. And in this first great constitutional battle, it seemed like Parliament was the undisputed champion. But here's the thing about these huge constitutional questions. They are rarely settled for good. This verdict wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. It was really just the opening shot in a debate that would rage on for decades.
This decision kicked off an incredible constitutional tug-of-war. For years, the Shankari Prasad ruling held firm. Parliament's power was unlimited. But then, in 1967, in the Golokhnov case, the Supreme Court did a complete 180 and said, nope, we were wrong. Fundamental rights are sacred and cannot be amended. This set up a massive confrontation, which finally climaxed in 1973 in the legendary Kesavananda Bharati case. It was there that the court finally landed on a compromise, the basic structure doctrine. They said, yes, Parliament can amend the Constitution, but it cannot destroy its fundamental identity, its core soul.
And that brings us right back to the question that Shankari Prasad first forced India to confront over 70 years ago, a question that's still being debated today. In a democracy, who should be the ultimate guardian of our most precious rights? Should it be the representatives we elect to Parliament, or should it be the independent judges in the courts? It's a question that cuts to the very core of what a democracy is, and there's still no easy answer.